Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Towards Life 3.0. My name is Matthias Risse, and I am the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. This is the next episodes in the Carr Center's Towards Life 3.0 series, which is co-sponsored with the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation, which is based at the Ash Center. And I'm delighted to be doing this again with my co-moderator, Sarah Hubbard, who will be joining us at the Q&A stage, who is a senior fellow in the Allen Lab. Many of you will know what the series does. We have now been doing it for a number of years. This is a series that is concerned with the ethical and human rights related challenges that come with technological innovation. We have chosen this title Towards Life 3.0 by adopting a phrase from a book title by MIT physicist Max Tegmark. So Life 3.0, if it comes to this, would be a life that is at least also populated by life forms that get to choose both the physical versions in which they exist and also the learning behavior that they engage in. So think something like uploaded brains that can choose the particular location, the kind of location they're in, and they can go about learning the way they see fit, as opposed to that Life 2.0, which is what we are, comes with substantial limitations on physical shape, but has degrees of freedom already in the learning behavior, whereas Life 1.0, and think bacteria, is a kind of life where pretty much everything is fixed through genetics. So bacteria come in a certain shape and they do certain things. They have certain information available. So there's not much of learning happening there. So all of that is fixed. That's Life 1.0. So we have named the series after that title in order to have a bit of an horizon, an endpoint of where this might all be going, and also to express the fact that the stage of human history that we might well be in is at this transitional stage from Life 2.0 towards Life 3.0. But there is, of course, a whole lot of uncertainty connected to when Life 3.0, if ever, might come about and exactly what this would look like. What we do know, however, is that there is a whole lot of ethics and human rights related challenges connected to technological innovation already, no matter where this concretely will be taking us. And so that's really been the theme of this series over the last several years. And today we are delighted to be joined by Jamie Susskind. I'm going to say a few things about Jamie in a moment. The title of his talk today is going to be The Digital Republic: Can Freedom and Democracy Survive in an Age of Powerful Technologies? Jamie Susskind is a well-known presence here at Harvard University, has been in fellowships here, has joined us for various events over time. Always a terrific contributor to events on our premises here, has also made an impressive, created an impressive niche for himself in the business of writing insightful books at the intersection of technology and political theory. His first book, actually, almost 15 years ago now, is called Karl Marx and the British Intellectuals in the 1930s, which is among lots of great things about that book, is actually also created a wonderful way into the technology debates, because the Marxist tradition has always had a lot to say about the technological tradition, as did the existentialist tradition, but it's the liberal tradition that really had to do a lot of catching up by making technology central, which is what we need in this age. So having a grounding in Marx certainly basically means having some terrific prerequisites for doing the work that Jamie then ended up doing later. The way I encountered his work first was through his second book then, a marvelous book called Future Politics: Living Together in a World Transformed by Tech. And that is a book that in very thorough ways engages with technological change in the political arena, primarily from a legal standpoint, also bringing in a whole lot of really interesting political theory, political philosophy, is looking at the ways in which technology profoundly transforms the interactions between citizens and the political process. So that book was also an important inspiration for my own work in this domain that started roughly at that time also. And then his third book just came out in 2022, and I think the title is quite close. The title of that book is quite close to the title of today's talk. So I'm assuming we're going to get a bit of an introduction to the themes from that book. That book is called The Digital Republic on Freedom and Democracy in the 21st Century. And that is an in-depth engagement of the dangerous problems and then also possible solutions to this enormous role that big tech private industry has started to play in our lives as human beings and as citizens. Jamie Susskind, I should say, is a practicing lawyer, and in addition also writes these fascinating books and has quite a presence in the lecture scenery among these topics. And it is a great pleasure to have Jamie Susskind with us here. I should also say to you, the audience, as always, we are eager to introduce your questions later. So I'm turning over to Jamie now, but then once Jamie is finished with his talk, Sarah and I will rejoin, and we'll keep an eye also on the Q&A part, and we'll be eagerly looking forward to seeing your questions, and we'll integrate them into the conversation with Jamie. But now, without further ado, Jamie, welcome to the screen, and the screen, in fact, now is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor. I hope that after the clicking I've just done, you can both see and hear me, and you can see my first slide. If any of that isn't right, hopefully someone will pop up and tell me. Let me first of all thank you for such a generous introduction. It's wonderful to be, albeit digitally, back at Harvard and talking about such interesting and important topics. My work, as you say, focuses on answering some of the big questions that technology raises. And I like to imagine the future by using words that are familiar to us: power, freedom, democracy, justice. And today's talk is going to be focused on one of those in particular, democracy, with just a little bit of freedom sprinkled in as well. I want to begin with a story that I often tell, or an anecdote. I don't even think it's true. I think it's apocryphal, but it's about what Henry Ford once said. Henry Ford wasn't a very nice man, but he brought the car to the mass market in the last century. And he said that if he'd asked people what they wanted, people would have told them that they wanted faster horses. And I think about that a lot, because I think that a lot of the way that we imagine the future is faster horses thinking. We imagine a world that is essentially like our world, but just a little faster, perhaps a little sleeker, a little bit more glass and chrome. But it's possible that we are standing at the edge of a transformation for humankind, which is as transformational for the way that we live together as the Industrial Revolution, the Agricultural Revolution, the invention of writing, these other great inflection points in the course of human civilization. And that tomorrow may be as different from today as the car was from the horse that preceded it. And if that's right, it means that we can't afford to be complacent about some of the things we take for granted, or some of the things we have become used to in the political scenery around us. Before I get on to talking about democracy, I just want to lay out some of my kind of premises for this talk, just to tell you where I'm coming from. I don't want to give a technological exposition. That's not what this is. But I want to tell you about what I imagine the world we're moving into might look like. And in particular, I think we are moving into a world where you can no longer be certain that the only people who can speak and debate and deliberate are human beings. And that's pretty profound. We are, in fact, the first generation in human history who are not the only ones who generate text, who generate speech. In the past, if there was text or speech, you knew it had come from a human. You might believe it came from a god or from a spirit, but in scientific terms, you knew that some other person had said it. And that's not going to be true for our children. They, like we already kind of are, will live alongside machines which are capable of utterances that are as sophisticated, as persuasive, as lyrical as anything that certainly an ordinary human could come up with, but perhaps even a superhuman. Now, I'm not saying that my argument depends on these machines, these systems becoming sentient or conscious, or having the kind of creativity and neural activity that human beings have. In fact, I'm quite willing to accept that these systems are nothing like us. They don't think like us. They don't think at all. They process vast amounts of information and using it and with enormous computing power, they generate appropriate responses to stimuli, and those stimuli might be language. But in a sense, that doesn't really matter, or at least it only matters up to a point, and perhaps I'll come on to that in a moment. The basic premise of this talk, though, is that in the future, it won't just be us who can chat about politics. There will be machines that can do it as well. They'll be able to argue, to persuade, to manipulate, to tell truth, but also to lie. And it strikes me that that is a profound change and raises profound questions for democracy. And I'm not entirely convinced that we have the answers to the questions that it raises. In fact, I'm not even sure that we're really asking the right questions yet. So I want to use my talk today just to explore some of them. Deliberation is, I would say, one of the two main building blocks of democracy. The other one is voting, which I'm going to touch on at the end. But essentially, in a modern democracy, there are two things going on. One is that the population discusses issues. They might discuss them in their front room or on the internet, or they might watch the news where people discuss it, or they might watch politicians debating in debating chambers. But essentially, the act of oral communication or written communication whereby we exchange ideas is an inherent part of democracy. The second inherent part, I would argue, is voting. But I just want to focus on deliberation for now, because I think it's one of the areas of democracy that's likely to be most profoundly affected by digital technology and by AI in particular. The questions I want to ask are this. Well, let me first start by setting a scene. I want you to imagine a world where non-human systems can participate in political discourse, in political deliberation. So they are able to write an article in the newspaper. They are able to get into a debate on X or Twitter. They are able to produce manifestos. They are able to produce awesome orations and speeches. And they may well be able to do so in a way that is more persuasive, more powerful, certainly than the average human, but indeed more so even than your average politician. And to me, there is a really interesting and important set of questions that need to be answered about how that kind of world, how that kind of democracy should operate. And let me just list some of them. Firstly, what kind of protection should be given to that kind of speech, the speech of non-humans participating in the democratic process? So there might be some people, for instance, who would say that actually the speech, that's all very well, it's all very useful, but the speech of humans should always be prioritized. There will be others who say that these machines should be treated as agents of the humans who design, own, operate, or control them, and therefore should be afforded the same protection as the speech of human beings should. There will be others who say that this speech is essentially worthless. It should be afforded no protection at all. That's not to say it should be banned, although some people will say it should be banned. But there will be others who say, look, this stuff is fake. It's ersatz. It's not real. It's not a legitimate contribution to democratic debate. And also, it's risky. And so for those reasons, it shouldn't have the protection that human speech currently has. Now, I'm in England, and we have a tradition of protecting speech here, governed by the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 10. Of course, America has its own First Amendment tradition. These legal traditions are going to have to develop answers to the question of how much weight and how much protection should be afforded to non-human speech. The starting point for human political speech is that it is afforded a very high degree of protection. The reason that's an important question is because a series of other questions flow from it, because it's not until you've decided how much protection such speech should have that you can decide how it, if at all, it can be restricted or regulated. So for instance, there'll be some people who say that actually non-human systems shouldn't participate in the political process at all. Or there should be certain spaces, perhaps certain platforms or news channels or whatever, where such voices are prohibited, they're forbidden. Or such voices should only be allowed to participate on certain terms. For instance, if they identify themselves, which is something I'll come on to in a minute, as non-human. Because pausing there for a second, in the future, these systems are not just going to be disembodied lines of text on a screen like ChatGPT. They will have faces, they will have voices, and perhaps those faces and voices will be engineered to be as persuasive and attractive as possible to whoever happens to be listening to them. Now, such systems are obviously capable of doing immense damage. So, for instance, they can act a lot more quickly if they are, because of their automated nature, than human beings can. You could have one system debating 100,000 different people at the same time on the internet in a way that a single human being obviously could never do. But if your answer to that is, well, we should place restrictions, we should place guardrails, you run into the question of, can you do that in light of your answer to the first question, which is this protected speech? Is it speech which the law should respect, or at least respect in the same way as it respects human speech? Finally, there's this question of identification. Does it matter if the person you are deliberating with isn't actually a human being at all? Should you always be entitled to know whether what you are talking to is a person or a non-person? And one of the reasons I think it's important that we remember that our current artificial intelligence systems are not persons and they do not have personhood is that it is much easier, in my view at least, to imagine regulations and restrictions on such systems because they don't have that human quality. They don't lose anything in terms of dignity or human rights when you place restrictions on them. Will that always be true of these systems? Probably not. There will probably be systems in the future which satisfy almost all of our ethical tests for personhood, in which case the debate may change again. But I suspect at that point, the question is going to be, what protection should there be for human beings, rather than what protection should there be for the life forms they have created? So I don't view these as small questions. I also don't view them as tremendously remote. I think these are questions we're going to have to grapple with in our lifetime if democracy is to survive in the form, at least vaguely, in the way that we understand it, the way that we understand and know it now. But what I've put on this slide are some words relating to what I consider to be even deeper questions still. Because it seems to me that if you want to answer the questions that I was just posing, you need to first have a model in your own head about what the purpose of democratic deliberation actually is. And then you can say, well, machine involvement in it is either furthering that purpose or undermining it. So for instance, epistemic, if you believe the main purpose of democratic deliberation is the fruitful exchange of information, such as to arrive at good policy outcomes, then you're going to be quite pro machines being permitted to take part in democratic deliberation, at least in a properly regulated way. Because what you will see is that these systems are going to be able to debate politics in a way that is better than we can, or at the very least can improve the way that we debate politics, the way that we moderate ourselves, the way that we discuss. It would be very naive of us, indeed arrogant, to suppose that these non-human systems couldn't somehow contribute to debate and deliberation. And so if democratic deliberation is just about, or is primarily about, achieving an epistemically positive result by getting to the right answers, then we should be using all of the instruments at our disposal. But there's another reason we deliberate, and it's to legitimate the democratic process. One of the things about living in democracies is that sometimes you don't get the result that you want at the ballot box. Sometimes things don't go your way. But if you have had the opportunity not just to vote, but to debate, to make your views heard, whether it's in the workplace canteen or in your living room or by going to a public square. What deliberation allows us to do is to participate and thereby to legitimate the democratic process, including, most importantly, when it works against us. Now, if that's the purpose of deliberation, I think you're going to be quite bearish about machine involvement. You're going to say that actually what's important is that human beings feel that they're participating in a legitimate process, and the legitimacy is itself derived from their participation in it. And if that participation is diluted or otherwise made less important by other non-human systems muscling in on it, then you might find that the legitimating purpose of deliberation is somehow undermined. Thirdly, performative. One of the amazing things about democratic discourse is that it produces great poetry, great speeches, almost art, great beauty and inspiration of the kind that allows us to live in imagined communities, allows us to understand the bonds that hold us together, that touches us in the heart, not just in the head. And here I think there's some room for debate about the role of machines. Matthias mentioned a moment ago my first book, Future Politics, which I wrote in 2018. And one of the questions I asked myself in that book was, are there some things which human beings do which have value by virtue specifically of the fact that they are done by a human being? And so the example I always thought of was, think about buying a birthday present for a loved one. The joy in that, from the perspective of the loved one, is often from knowing that you've applied your mind to the question of what they want and what they would like, and then you've come up with whatever you've come up with. So there might be, for instance, a machine learning system which can predict with extraordinary accuracy what your wife would like for Christmas, but that using that system, even though it would get to the right result, might somehow undermine the value of the gift, because it's the thought, as it were, that counts, the human thought. Another example I gave was the best man speech at a wedding. Now, I surmised that it might be possible sometime in the future to get a system to produce a best man speech, which was hilarious, which was touching, and so forth. But then I asked the question, would that speech be undermined if the bride and groom knew that it had been produced by a machine learning system that had processed 100,000 previous best man speeches and churned out the kind of platonic ideal of the best man speech? And I thought at the time that the answer to that would be yes. But lo and behold, in the interim, hundreds of services have popped up offering exactly that, the ability to write a best man speech using a machine learning system. I mention this because I'm now thinking about the performative aspect of deliberative democracy. And I'm thinking, well, imagine the great speeches of Martin Luther King, of Abraham Lincoln, of John F. Kennedy, whoever your political heroes are. And now imagine that you could foresee a system that could produce better rhetoric, that could produce a more theatrical performance, that could produce the right words in the right moment. Would that have value? Would it have the same value as a human being doing it? Would they both have value, but different values? The performative aspect I don't find easy to come down one way or the other. It strikes me that some of what we like in politics is we admire political leaders. We know that they're flawed human beings like us, but we respect them for doing their best in a messy and uncertain world. And it's their very humanness that allows us to feel connected to them. At the same time, many of them are rubbish. And it might be that, if the right words are called for in a particular moment, that a human being doesn't have them. So I think that the performative side of things goes both ways. But here I land on what actually may be one of the more important aspects of democratic deliberation, which is the self-actualizing aspect of it, or if we're being pretentious, what we might call the Aristotelian aspect of it. For the Aristotle, obviously Aristotle didn't understand democracy in the same way that we did, but he believed that man was a man, as he put it, but obviously human beings are a political animal, and it is only by participating in politics that one becomes fully human, fully oneself. And so to use a kind of cliche, it really is the taking part that counts for Aristotle. It's not, and you're not just doing it for the benefit of the polity. You're doing it to fulfill some urge within yourself to become a fully self-actualized human. If that's right, you'd have to make sure that the machine participation in that process didn't undermine our ability to self-actualize, didn't undermine our ability to become fully human via full participation, or as full as possible, in a political process. And it seems to me that the risk of human beings being marginalized from their own democratic processes is not one that you can discount. Even if it had better epistemic results, an Aristotelian might say, you've still lost something too important. You've lost something too vital. So that's a little kind of whistle-stop tour of deliberation. I wasn't planning to talk much about voting today, which I see as the main rival to deliberation. Well, it's not really a rival, they're complementary. The other main pillar of democracy is voting. But it seems to me that voting is kind of equally something that you might have to think carefully about the role of machine learning systems or kind of large language models in the future. I mean, if you think about it, voting, you know, where you put a tick in a box once every few years between a relatively small number of options, is an extraordinarily narrow and data light way of registering political preferences. If democracy is about marshalling people's political preferences, it would do better in some ways to draw on the immense amount of data that actually exists out there about us and about the way that we live. So it's not impossible for me, for instance, to imagine a sort of hierarchy of, not a hierarchy, a kind of ratchet of machine participation in the voting process in the future. So you might imagine a world where instead of, you know, voting on a piece of paper every few years, you're invited to vote once or twice a week on using a device on your phone on local issues. Further on, you might have a system that votes on your behalf 1,000 times a day on all kinds of different issues. And instead of just giving a binary yes/no vote, can express a weight, a degree of support. And that degree of support can be based on what you've told this system your values are, but also what it knows about you, what it knows about your financial circumstances, your employment circumstances, your family circumstances, your hobbies and leisure activities, your environment, and the natural landscape near where you live. Again, though, you have to step back and ask yourself, what's the point of voting, right? So Aristotle would say the taking part is what matters. Others would say the epistemic aspect of it is what matters. Voting is the single best way we have of marshalling people's political preferences. Well, will it be in the future? I don't know about that. So these are, again, I didn't want to talk an enormous amount about voting today, but I did want to touch on it to give you the sense, from my research at least, that deliberation isn't just something that is exciting to talk about with digital technology because, you know, we're currently in a mania for large language models. It seems to me that almost every assumption we have about democracy, why it matters, why we participate in it, how we participate in it, is going to be in some way touched or changed by digital technology. And what we have to ask ourselves in our generation is, you know, is this faster horses? Is this the same thing, but a little bit slicker? Or are we potentially on the cusp of something rather different from democracy, or at least democracy as we understand it in its kind of 20th century form? I do think it is naive to suppose that the system of government that we have just now is the final and best form of human self-government. Not least because it doesn't seem to work very well most of the time, but also we need humility in the face of what history teaches us, which is that systems come and go, and that as as democracy goes, it's actually the anomaly. It's a historical anomaly. It's not very common that democracies have existed. And even today, our democracies are looking kind of fragile, kind of flaky in places. There are genuine questions about whether they can meet the needs of the citizenry that uphold them. So I don't think we should be so arrogant as to suppose that the system we have just now is the final and best system, nor should we be so complacent as to assume that it is robust enough to withstand a tidal wave of technological change, which is going to upend almost everything else that we do in our lives. So I encourage you, the watchers of this webinar, to ask, not just in terms of democracy, but in terms of freedom, of justice, and all the other political buzzwords that matter to us. Is it going to be faster horses in the future, or are these things all on the cusp, on the precipice of great change? I incline to the latter view. And my worry, of course, is that we're not ready. We're not ready for the journey that we're about to go on. We're not ready legally. We're not ready politically. We're also not ready intellectually. We don't yet have the body of words, the body of thoughts, the body of ideas, the body of ideologies that we need to make sense of this extraordinary world that we're moving into. And I hope you, like me, are interested in contributing to that journey and getting us there faster, because it is the great challenge of our generation.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jamie. Well, I will kick off some questions as people are leaving things in the Q&A. So to start with, you previously talked about, some tools like citizens' assemblies in improving deliberation and deliberative democracy. So I'd be curious to hear you maybe talk a little bit more about that, any successful examples you've seen, any other kind of tools that you think help us maybe answer some of the questions you've raised around deliberation.
Absolutely. So in that talk just then, I tried to be fairly agnostic, fairly balanced in sort of setting out what I thought the key themes were. One of the big questions that I ask in my work is what is the most effective way of governing powerful digital technologies? That's actually is looking at this issue a different way, because what I was just doing in that talk just then was asking how a digital technology is going to change the way that we govern, as opposed to the question about how we govern digital technologies. These questions are related, but it can help to keep them conceptually distinct. One of the things that I think is important is that if you want digital technology to develop in a way that makes us more free rather than less, that makes our societies more democratic rather than less, that makes our economy more just rather than less, is that you can't just leave them to develop according to market norms and expect everything to turn out okay. And for that reason, I'm very interested in the governance of technology. But I recognize the limitations of traditional democratic systems when it comes to imposing norms and values on technological development. So to answer your question at great length, one of the things that I've pointed to in my work is citizens' assemblies, where essentially discrete policy questions can be put to small-ish groups of people under ideal deliberative conditions. So they're given enough time, they're given enough balanced information, they're given access to expertise, and they are left to reason their way to a conclusion. And that conclusion may be binding on a country, but it may also just be kind of recommendatory. So, in Ireland, for instance, a very famous use of the citizens' assembly process in relation to things like gay marriage and abortion rights. It wasn't binding, but it led to a substantial change in the law. Does it have democratic legitimacy? I would say it does, in the same way that a jury does. If you randomly select people and give them, ideal conditions in which to deliberate, it makes it easier for other citizens to accept the legitimacy of what they decide. It's not as good as a kind of, a national decision, but in some ways it might be better, because a referendum, for instance, isn't an ideal deliberative condition. It is a binary yes or no thing, where often, as this country has shown, often the standard of the debate is incredibly low. So what kind of things do I think deliberative assemblies could be useful on? Well, they can decide things like local policy, you know, the rules governing self-driving cars in a particular metropolitan area. They might be useful in deciding questions of what we would call competition law or what you would call antitrust law. You know, should these two companies be allowed to merge? Should company A be allowed to buy company B? That's currently a dry and dusty question of legal policy that is left to the courts, applying quite dry and dusty economic principles. It seems to me that if there are democratic implications to such things, then the citizenry might have a role. But also more profound things like, what should our attitudes be towards transformative digital technologies? Why not get people to do a little bit more, to participate a little bit more, you know, to get that call up like they do for jury service, to go and debate in good faith with their fellow citizens for a few days or for a few weeks. I see only positives from that.
I'd like to come back to your best man speech at the wedding, which I remember from your book, and it's actually quite fascinating to think about certain parts of books written prior to ChatGPT and Claude and all these, right? I mean, it's as true of my book as also of your book. So of course, you know, when your book came out in 2018, and at that time, this seemed like, yeah, one read that and one would think, yeah, you know, there is something to the display of human affection, the way human ingenuity is on display, the care that comes in through this, right? So it's what I do for this other person. So one is just intuitively inclined to agree, but also this is happening in a context where you know, it is just not common that people are using machine-produced best man speeches. And so now, you know, this was a breakthrough. I mean, the pace of change generally is insane, right? And at the stage, and so 2023 was this breakthrough year. ChatGPT, Midjourney, and now we have text to video. It's just so the acceleration is enormous, and so now it is actually, I would think probably these speeches produced by ChatGPT are becoming a lot more common. So, and I'm wondering, so think about, you know, in the old days when toys were started to be produced by machines. Yeah, so there was probably a time when a handmade toy was a fabulous gift to a kid. But then when machine-produced toys came into circulation, they were so much better than handmade gifts. Somehow the appeal of this being handmade was quickly evaporated by the fact that everybody else had these fantastic machine-made toys. So the little joy or consolation even came from the fact that this was handmade. And so I wonder, you know, is it going to be like this for speeches as well? You know, maybe not next year, but in 3 years that, you know, speeches are given, you say, well, I did this myself. And that looks like this will be like, you know, a handmade toy given, and that the response will be, you know, this is not a good use of your time. And if you had done it with a machine and maybe you could have twisted, it would have been a much better speed. So, you know, what kind of old-fashioned person are you? You know, don't you, so is this just kind of the pace of change that's hitting us in the face?
I have quite strong views on this, and I think that some people will disagree with them. But my view is that we consistently overestimate how important we actually think human involvement in things is. So things like, think of something like online dating. 15 years ago, you know, online dating was a kind of joke. It was a kind of creepy joke. You would not admit that you'd met your partner on some kind of festering website for weirdos. Nowadays, more than half of couples are algorithmically paired, and they're all getting married and having kids. And, you know, that's not even taken a generation. That's taken just, you know, a few short years. Now think about what people say about machines. They say, oh, yes, but, you know, but can a machine really produce art? Can it really produce films? Can it really produce architecture? And now think about what professional people, including many in my profession, say. When people come to their lawyer, they don't just want legal advice. They want the hand on the shoulder. They want the human touch. Or when people go to the doctor, they don't just want a diagnosis. They want the bedside manner. I think all of this is overestimated and overstated. Actually, if my clients could choose between a really nice human lawyer who got the answer right 65% of the time and a machine that got it right 95% of the time, they'd choose the machine. I think that's even more true in medicine. And if you come back to things like art and literature and film, are we really going to say that a system which can produce films, of the same level of or greater than creativity than a Hitchcock or a Tarantino or a Spielberg, it's all coming around the corner, and people will turn their noses up at it for a year or so, and then they'll go and watch it because it will be extraordinary. Same with art and architecture. Yes, there will always be a kind of fetish, and it's not a bad fetish, for things that are done in a human artisanal way. It sort of connects us back to an earlier form of civilization, a pre-industrial world where the human touch was incredibly important. But I actually think there's a kind of class element to this as well, because what technology promises to do, and I'm pro-technology, is democratize so many things that are currently highly exclusive, highly culturally exclusive. I hope that in the future, it's not just rich and middle class people who can access legal advice, who can access swift, excellent medical advice, who can access an interior designer to tell them how to do their home, who can who can maybe create beautiful art according to their own customs and tastes. This is stuff that only rich people can do just now. And in the future, it might be something that all of us can do. And that strikes me as being a good thing. So I told you my views were strong. I know not everyone will agree with them, but I do think that we overestimate the importance that we actually attach as consumers to the human in the loop.
Perfect. I will take one of these audience questions. So this one says, thanks, Jamie. You spoke mainly about how AI will affect citizens, but I wonder questions you think this wave of AI raises for political parties, will they even be relevant in the future? And if so, how will it affect their strategies, incentives, and operations? It is a historic election year, so I'm sure we'll already start to see some of this come up, but would love some of your thoughts.
Great question. So, I mean, why do political parties exist? How did they come to exist? They exist because within the framework, the institutional framework of our democracies, there needs to be, or there is a tendency towards the gathering together of interests to pursue common goals. So if you want to achieve something politically in a modern, advanced industrial democratic society, and this has been true for at least a century, you can't really do it on your own. You need to be with other people. So you need to form factions or parties that can organize and campaign and unify large groups of the population. Of course, this wasn't always true. Early democracies didn't have parties. They've evolved. And I think they've evolved because of the particular institutional context, because it's advantageous for them to do it. So to be old-fashioned for a second, I think so long as that institutional context exists, the political parties will exist, right? So long as we have parliamentary democracies, political parties remain a rational way of politically organizing. Even if you think about something kind of semi-revolutionary, like Emmanuel Macron starting his En Marche movement in France, that wasn't an attack on the political system. That was a revolution within the system, a new party, rather than a change to the fact of parties themselves. And so my fundamental view is, so long as those institutions remain the same, parties will remain. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. It's quite good to be able to aggregate people's views, if not into two, then maybe into 4 or 5 kind of different groups in society, which roughly overlap. I think it helps people to orient themselves. It helps us to think of policy. So I don't think that's a bad thing. Obviously, artificial intelligence, I mean, the question about how it affects their strategies, incentives, and operations is a very big one. It partly depends on some of the questions I was asking in my talk about how we regulate and govern this stuff. Because, parties will be looking to use the persuasive power, the persuasive force of these technologies for their ends and to neutralize them in respect of their opponents. They will be looking to use the most advanced data science to target persuasive content where it is most effective and at the people who are most receptive or most receptive to a particular message. That kind of micro-targeting thing has come in and out of fashion. And I remember when Obama did something like it, everyone thought it was great. And then when Trump did something like it, everyone thought it was terrible. And now I think people sort of wonder how effective it is at all. And I think the jury is out. And I also think that European data protection law makes it pretty difficult on this side of the pond to make it work. But certainly there are very clever people out there trying to find ways to harness the extraordinary power of data analytics to make political campaigning more effective.
So to connect back to the subject of the importance of the human contribution, so one of the big trends right now, as of 2024, is the increasing presence of digital humans. So basically, it's machines, but they look human and they do all sorts of things for you. And one can see this go all sorts of directions. So again, pace of change is enormous, right? It's only been a year pretty much now that we had what you talked about at the beginning as, machines can actually do deliberation, right? At least they can come across as if that were deliberation. And so we have these digital humans now who can engage with us in all sorts of ways. And this could include things like any number of coaching activities, right? Really going from banking advice, financial advice, pretty sophisticated advice, the sort of thing that's very expensive to come by if you are an off-the-street person, to Freudian analysis, right? And so the digital humans, they're just on the kind of breakthrough moment here of their own. And locally here in Cambridge, one person who has rung alarm bells around this quite a bit is Sherry Turkle. This has been the kind of thing she has been writing about for a while, and basically in a way this is now all coming home, right? So these chickens are coming home to roost, and she is raising alarm bells around it. And one thing to say back to that actually is, well, in all these professions, these kind of professional advisors, again ranging from the banking type to the Freudian type, they are kind of exercising certain protocols of sorts anyway, right? So there's a body of knowledge that comes across in the form of certain protocols, enters your life, applied to your situation. So it's a quasi-algorithmic activity anyway. So if it's given over to machines, you're kind of squeezing out all sorts of weird phenomena like transference in Freudian analysis, carelessness and corruption in the finance sector. So this is kind of the pro, right? You get the good stuff from professional services without the human interference. But you do have machine intimacy right where it matters most to you. So how do, in terms of going with what your early you seem to be quite upbeat about, more machine interference is not an issue. How comfortable would you be with all these professional services, ever more being digital human?
Yeah, I'd be comfortable. I mean, the truth is that professions don't exist to give professionals a job. They exist because people need access to expertise. And if that expertise can be rendered via non-human means, then I don't see why that is a less legitimate desire, at least for the end users. I mean, goodness, lawyers and doctors, we talk about ourselves the whole time, but we're not the ones who matter. It's the people who matter are the people who need these services. Where I think there's slightly more difficulty is when you start seeing machines fulfilling not just kind of professional roles, which have a kind of arm's length nature to them, but what about kind of emotional, erotic, sexual, even saying it now kind of, it makes us all think, oh, that's a bit weird. But is that just what online dating was 15 years ago? I don't know. In the future, when people have these deep emotional connections, these deep erotic connections with non-human systems, will we just be saying in 15 years' time, look, in retrospect, this was obvious. People have fundamental needs. They might not be getting met. If they can be met via proxies for human counterparties, then why not? What I love about all of these questions is that they ask us, they demand a degree of kind of clarity, don't they? They make us ask, what is it that really matters here? What matters in a relationship between a person and their doctor? What matters in a relationship between a person and some emotional or sexual partner? And of course, there will be people who say that, you know, what exists between two humans in that regard is irreplaceable and unsurpassable. And maybe they're right. But one thing that I definitely think is a mistake is to always test artificial intelligence against the best possible human alternative. So people are always like, well, come on, what would you rather have as your robot? You know, sorry, what would you rather have as your lawyer? You know, an expert barrister who's argued 50 cases before the Supreme Court, or some robot? But that's not the choice. The choice is between some robot and some average high street lawyer who, you know, is as good as or as bad as the next person. So when you think about relationships, you know, it may be that a relationship with a non-human system does not compare to the exquisite relationship that you might have at the best point of the best relationship that you have in your life, if you're lucky enough to have it. But is that really the test? For someone who's been lonely for 10 years, they're not aiming for the best, they're aiming for better.
Maybe I would play off that really quick and back to some of your comments about deliberation. So I'd say one fear that a lot of people have is that, you know, we'll begin to fully outsource a lot of our participation as a citizen, and that this becomes this slippery slope and we become really disengaged and democracy erodes. So I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts around this and maybe how it fits into some of the other like questions and things you've been saying, because it is tough. It's like, how would you know, some of your other answers have been very like pro technology. Like if it can do it better, that's great. Democratize it, and make it accessible to everyone. But in this case, you know, how could you measure something like people's participation in and that sort of replacement, I guess. I don't know. You mentioned a bit with the self-actualizing.
It's such a good, yeah, sorry, go on.
No, that's all.
It's such a good and fair question. And actually, I have two answers to it. So if we want to keep democracy as we currently kind of understand it, which is essentially human self-governance, then that is an area where it is unsafe to delegate it to machines, even if they may be better than us. They may be better deliberators, they may be better voters, they may be better policymakers and politicians. But if the point of democracy is for us to govern ourselves, to muddle along imperfectly, but for it to be our government, then that is one area where you should be wary of the trespass of digital technology. And so I would place limits on the involvement of it. But in 500 years' time, will people look back and be like, that was very naive? There are far superior ways of governing oneself which use digital technology, which aren't democratic in the way that seem to matter so much to these people in the 21st century, but which lead to more effective allocation of resources, which lead to peace, which lead to fewer wars and famines, which get rid of all of the silly conflicts that plague 21st century democracies. I can't imagine that system fully formed. Of course I can't. None of us can. But I'm not naive enough to suppose that there won't be something that comes next. And so this is the faster horses thing. If what you really want is a horse, then yeah, you just want to make it a bit faster by human participation, do a little bit better. But it might be that there's a car out there that is, in which case we probably can't be too squeamish about machines getting involved, because it's probably the involvement of machines that would lead to that superior form of government to begin with.
Thank you. And as our last question, let me pass on what Lucas Bird is asking. He says, I worry with respect to your point about technology democratizing a number of resources or opportunities in terms of class, that new tech in AI, as with many other technological advancements, will be appropriated and gate-kept by the major capital players internationally. For example, the newest and best medical procedures are only accessible to the people able to pay for them, preventing most of society from taking advantage of the benefits of new technology. Do you see the creation of artificial barriers to access by big capital as a potential obstacle to the democratizing potential of AI? If so, how can we try and avoid this outcome?
Lucas, I just can't agree with that question more. If left to purely market forces, will you get social media platforms that make our democracies safer? No. Will you get artificial intelligence systems that democratize access to art, literature, culture, professional services? No. There is no reason to suppose that the commercial development of AI alone will lead to the benefits that it could bring, in the same way that there is no reason to suppose that purely privately developing a particular form of medicine would mean that all the people in the world who needed that medicine would be able to access it. One thing doesn't flow from the other. And you are right to be concerned about it, Lucas, and I am too. The answer is we need a system of laws and regulations which makes sure that the extraordinary benefits of digital technology are not really merely confined to those who seek to profit from them. I'm not a socialist in this regard, or a Marxist. I don't say that they should all be collectively owned. And I do believe that the capitalist innovation that is unleashed in a free market is vital for the development of these technologies, but it is necessary but not sufficient. We need to make sure that the most important technologies are not just confined for the benefit of a rich elite or for the benefit of the corporations or indeed the governments that happen to control them at a particular time. So for me, Lucas, you've hit on what is really the great political question of our age, which is how do we make these technologies work, not just according to market logic, but according to political values, democratic values, liberal values. And it won't happen by itself.
Perfect. Well, I think that is a powerful note to end on. I just want to say a big thank you to Jamie for joining us today. We really, really appreciate it. You know, this topic couldn't be more timely given this historic election year. So we really appreciate you sharing with us today, and look forward to everyone joining in on our next session. So thank you all so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you both so much for having me. It's real.